There is a map. It sits in an archive, held behind a kind of institutional silence that surrounds old documents no one has looked at closely in a long time. The folder it came in is worn. The edges of the paper have darkened slightly with age. The ink, once sharp and deliberate, has softened into that particular shade of brown that very old documents tend to develop over decades of storage. Nothing about its appearance signals anything unusual. Nothing about the way it was filed, cataloged, or stored suggests that anyone, at any point, considered it to be anything other than what the label on the folder says it is. A land map. Made in 1910. That is the official record. That is what the institution holding it will confirm if you ask. The date is written on the document itself, noted in the catalog entry, and supported by the standard assessments that were done when the map was formally accessioned into the archive. On the surface, there is no reason to question it. Maps like this one were made in large numbers during that era. They were administrative tools, not artistic objects. They recorded property lines, land boundaries, and geographical reference points for legal and governmental purposes. They were meant to be accurate, functional, and unremarkable. And for a long time, this one was exactly that, unremarkable. But at some point, someone looked at it more carefully than the people before them had, not with any particular suspicion, not as part of a formal investigation, just the kind of careful, patient attention that certain researchers bring to old documents when they have the time and the inclination to go slowly. And in that slower, closer examination, something became visible that had not drawn attention before. One detail, small, easy to overlook, the kind of thing that blends into the surrounding information unless you are specifically looking for inconsistencies. It does not announce itself. It does not stand apart from the rest of the document visually. It sits within the map the way any other notation sits, as though it belongs there, as though it has always been part of the original work. But it does not match the time period the map claims to come from. That is not a dramatic statement. It is not an accusation. It is simply an observation that, once made, becomes difficult to set aside. The detail in question is not consistent with what would have been recorded, referenced, or even known at the time this map was supposedly created. It points to something, a structure, a boundary, a reference point, depending on how you interpret it. That should not have been available to whoever drew this map in 1910. This raises questions, not loud ones, not the kind that demand immediate answers, but quiet, persistent questions of the kind that tend to stay with you longer than the obvious ones do. At first, the natural response is to look for a simple explanation. Human error is always the first candidate. Surveyors and cartographers working in the early 20th century were professionals, but they were not infallible. Mistakes happened. A wrong notation, a misread reference, a copied detail from an incorrect source. These things occurred in historical documents and have been identified and explained many times before. There is an entire field of archival research dedicated to understanding exactly these kinds of errors in old records. So the question becomes, does this detail look like an error? And here is where it starts to become unclear. Because when you examine the detail in context, when you look at the information surrounding it, the way it is integrated into the rest of the map, the relationship it has with other notations nearby, it does not carry the marks that errors typically carry. It is not crossed out and corrected. It is not annotated with a question or a qualification. It does not appear to be a careless slip. It appears, on the surface, to be a deliberate and considered piece of information placed exactly where it is on purpose. That is not proof of anything. Deliberate-looking errors are still errors. A surveyor could have made a confident, intentional mistake. It happens. But the appearance of confidence in a detail that should not exist is worth noting. It is the kind of thing that changes the nature of the question being asked. The question is no longer just what the detail is. The question is how it got there. That distinction matters more than it might seem. If the detail is an error, the story ends relatively quickly. Someone made a mistake. The mistake was never caught, and the document was filed and forgotten. That is a tidy explanation. It requires no further investigation and leaves no loose ends. But if the detail is not an error, if it was placed there with knowledge, with intent, or with access to information that was not supposed to exist at that point in time, then the story does not end. It opens, and that opening is uncomfortable, because it does not lead to a clear room. It leads to a corridor with several doors, none of which have been fully opened, and some of which may no longer be accessible at all. Researchers who have examined this document have not reached agreement. That in itself is worth paying attention to. Historical document analysis, while not an exact science, tends to produce some level of consensus when the evidence is straightforward. Experts look at the paper, the ink, the notation style, the reference points, the administrative language, and they form a picture. In most cases, that picture is reasonably coherent and reasonably agreed upon. In this case, it is not. Some researchers look at the anomalous detail and conclude it is minor, a notation error, possibly introduced by a later hand during a period when the document was being copied, referenced, or reviewed. These things happen in archival history more often than the public tends to realize. A document passes through many hands over a century. Someone makes a small mark, adds a small reference, and over time that addition becomes part of the document's identity without ever being formally acknowledged as a later addition. That explanation is reasonable. It accounts for the detail without requiring any unusual conclusions about the map's origins. But others look at the same detail and arrive at a different reading. They argue that the integration of the anomalous notation is too complete, too embedded in the surrounding content, to be a later addition. Later additions, they point out, tend to have tells, slight differences in ink aging, subtle changes in pressure or style, spatial positioning that does not quite align with the original layout. This detail, they say, does not show those tells. It looks original, and if it looks original, then the problem is not a later addition. The problem is the map itself. That disagreement has not been resolved, not because no one has tried, but because the evidence available does not currently provide a clean answer either way. The tests that would need to be done, using the most current analytical methods, have not been fully applied to this document. There are institutional, logistical, and resource-related reasons for that. None of them particularly mysterious. All of them somewhat frustrating if you are trying to understand what this document actually is. What remains, then, is an open question sitting inside an old folder in an archive that most people will never visit. It is worth considering, for a moment, how many documents like this one exist. Not necessarily documents with the same specific anomaly, but documents with unresolved questions, details that were noticed by one researcher, noted in a paper or a report, and then quietly set aside because there were no resources to pursue them further, or because the institutional priority was to move on to the next item in the catalog. The historical record is full of these small, unresolved observations. Most of them are genuinely minor. Most of them would probably yield simple explanations if someone had the time and the tools to look closely enough, but some of them would not. And the difficulty is that there is no efficient way to know, from the outside, which category any given anomaly falls into. This map, and this particular detail, has stayed in the conversation longer than most, not because it has been loudly promoted or widely publicized, but because the researchers who encountered it found the disagreement itself difficult to dismiss. When credible people who study the same type of document look at the same detail and reach opposite conclusions, that gap is not nothing. It is a signal that the question is genuinely open. It doesn't fully make sense to simply pick one explanation and move forward without addressing the other. Both possibilities have something to support them. Both possibilities have something they cannot fully account for. And that balance, that refusal of the evidence to fall cleanly on one side, is what keeps the question alive. There is also something worth noting about the broader context in which this map was created. The early 1900s were a period of significant administrative change in many regions. Land documentation was being standardized, reformed, and in some cases deliberately restructured to serve new legal and political purposes. The process was not always clean. Records from this period contain more inconsistencies than records from more stable administrative periods, and that background noise makes it harder to isolate any single anomaly and determine its significance with confidence. That context could support the error explanation. More inconsistencies in the general record means more opportunities for this kind of detail to appear without sinister meaning. But it could also, depending on how you read it, support the idea that this was a period in which motivated alterations to official documents were more feasible and less likely to be caught. Neither reading is proven. Both are plausible, and that is the situation as it currently stands. The investigation does not begin with a dramatic discovery. It begins with someone sitting with an old document, going slowly, and noticing that one small thing does not line up with everything else. It begins with a question that should have a simple answer and does not. It begins with the gap between what the record says and what the detail shows, a gap that is narrow enough to be almost invisible, but wide enough, once you see it, to make you wonder what else might be sitting inside it. That gap is what this investigation is about. Not the map as a whole, not the era it comes from, not the archive that holds it, just that one detail, and the question of how it got there and why. After all the examination and all the disagreement, no one has been able to give a complete, fully satisfying answer to either of those things. The records say it was made in 1910. That may be true. It may be entirely true, and the detail may have an explanation that simply has not been found yet. That is genuinely possible, but the detail is still there. It still does not match, and the people who have looked at it most carefully still do not agree on what that means. That is where this begins. The official explanation for this map is not complicated. It does not require unusual assumptions or difficult reasoning. It fits neatly into the kind of administrative history that archivists and regional historians deal with regularly. The kind of history that rarely attracts attention because there's nothing in it that seems to demand closer examination. The explanation is this. The map was made in 1910 as part of a routine land survey by surveyors working under the direction of a regional government office. That is what the record says. That is what the institution holding the document confirms. And for most of the time this document has existed, that explanation was accepted without question. To understand why the explanation seems so complete, it helps to understand what land surveying in that period actually looked like and why it was happening at the scale it was. The early 1900s were a period of significant administrative expansion across many parts of the world. Governments that had previously relied on informal or loosely maintained land records were under increasing pressure to formalize property boundaries in ways that could hold up in legal proceedings. The reason for that pressure was largely economic. Industrialization was changing how land was used. Factories needed sites. Railways needed corridors. Urban areas were expanding into land that had previously been rural, and as that happened, questions about who owned what became more urgent and more contested. Old and formal agreements between neighbors were no longer sufficient. Courts needed documents, and documents needed to be made. Regional survey offices were established or expanded during this period specifically to meet that need. They employed trained surveyors who followed standardized procedures, used calibrated instruments, and produced documents that were intended to serve as legally authoritative records of land ownership and boundary placement. The work was methodical. It was slow. A single survey of a moderately sized rural area could take weeks or even months, depending on the terrain and the level of detail required. The surveyors themselves were not making interpretive decisions. They were recording observable facts, where a road ended, where a river bent, where a stone marker had been placed, where one property's fence line met another's. Their job was to translate physical reality into a drawn document as accurately as their tools and training allowed. The tools were analog, measuring chains, theodolites, leveling instruments, and paper. Nothing was automatic. Every measurement was taken by hand and recorded by hand. The margin for error was real, but the professional standards of the time were clear about what was acceptable and what was not. This particular map was produced within that framework, or at least that is what the official account holds. A survey team operating in the region in 1910 covered a specific area of land, recorded what they found, and produced a drawn document that reflected the property boundaries and geographical features of that area at that point in time. The map was then submitted to the relevant administrative office, reviewed, approved, and filed. That process was standard. It happened thousands of times in offices across many countries during that era. What happened to the map after it was filed is also relatively well documented, at least in broad terms. It remained in the administrative system for some years, referenced occasionally when boundary questions arose in the area it covered, and eventually transferred to an archive as the original office's functions were reorganized or absorbed into a different administrative structure. Transfers like that were common. As governments reformed and consolidated, the records they had accumulated moved around. Some were lost. Some were damaged. Some arrived at their final archival destination in better condition than expected, and some in worse. This map arrived in reasonably good condition. The paper had aged, as paper does. The ink had faded to the brownish tone that old documents develop over long periods of storage. But the content was readable. The notations were clear enough to be transcribed. The boundaries it showed could be interpreted and, in some cases, compared against later surveys of the same area. When archivists cataloged it, they recorded the date from the document itself, confirmed it against the style and physical characteristics of the material, and filed it accordingly. The date on the document is 1910. The institution that holds it states that the paper composition is consistent with early 20th century production. The ink type and application are consistent with the notational methods used by survey offices during that period. The administrative language, the terminology, the abbreviations, the formatting of the boundary descriptions, matches what would be expected from a regional survey document of that era. Taken together, these elements form a coherent picture. That picture is the official explanation, and on its own terms, it is a strong one. It is not based on assumption alone. It is grounded in physical analysis and historical context. The people who confirmed this date were not being careless. They were applying the standard methods used to authenticate documents of this type, and those methods produced a consistent result. This is important to acknowledge clearly, because the question that follows is not about dismissing the official explanation. It is about understanding whether the official explanation accounts for everything in the document. Not just most things, but everything. And at first reading, it does appear to account for everything. The map looks like a 1910 survey map. It has the characteristics of a 1910 survey map. It was stored and transferred in the way that 1910 survey maps were stored and transferred. The provenance, the documented chain of custody from creation to archive, is largely intact and largely consistent. There are small gaps in the provenance record, as there are with almost any document that has passed through a century of institutional transitions. A few years here where the transfer records are incomplete, a period during which the office holding it underwent reorganization and the detailed custody logs were not maintained with full consistency. These gaps are not unusual. They are the normal texture of how old administrative records survive, or partially survive, across long periods of time. But gaps in provenance, even normal ones, are worth noting, because a gap is a period during which the document's history is not fully visible. What happened to the map during those periods is not recorded. Who had access to it, whether it was examined, whether anything about it was altered. None of that can be confirmed or denied for the periods where the custody record goes quiet. This raises questions, not accusations, not conclusions, just questions about whether the clean official picture is as complete as it appears, or whether the gaps in the record contain anything relevant to the anomalous detail that was eventually noticed. The authentication that confirmed the date did not, it should be said, involve a full forensic examination of every element of the document. It involved the standard checks that archivists apply when cataloging incoming materials, paper dating, ink assessment, stylistic analysis. Those checks are reliable for their intended purpose, which is to establish a general period of origin and confirm that a document is not an obvious modern forgery. They are not designed to detect partial alterations made within the same historical period, or to distinguish between an original notation and an early addition made by a contemporary hand using contemporary materials. That distinction is subtle but significant. If something was added to this map in, say, 1920 or 1925, using ink and paper consistent with that decade, a standard authentication process focused on confirming a 1910 origin would not necessarily catch it. The materials would still fall within the broad early 20th century range. The handwriting style, if executed carefully, might not differ noticeably from the original. The addition would look, to a standard review, like part of the original document. That is not what the official explanation claims happened. The official explanation does not address the anomalous detail in those terms at all. And this is where it becomes unclear, not because the explanation is wrong about what it addresses, but because it may not be addressing the right question. The explanation confirms that the map is from 1910. It does not confirm that every element of the map was part of the original 1910 survey. Those are related questions, but they are not the same question, and the difference between them is where the uncertainty lives. For most of the document's existence in the archive, that distinction was never raised. No one asked it, because no one had noticed a detail that made it relevant. The map was catalogued, referenced occasionally by historians studying land use patterns in the region, and otherwise left undisturbed. It was what it appeared to be, and there was no reason to look more closely. Then someone did look more closely, not because they were looking for an anomaly, but because the kind of slow, detailed attention that certain researchers bring to primary sources occasionally surfaces things that faster readings miss. And what that closer attention found was the detail, the notation, the reference, the element that does not line up with the 1910 date, sitting in the map as though it had always belonged there. The official explanation, as it stands, does not speak to that detail directly. It confirms the document's general period of origin. It confirms the paper and the ink. It confirms the administrative style and the provenance record, with its noted gaps. It presents a picture that is coherent, grounded, and reasonable, but it does not explain the detail that does not match. And that is not a small omission, because the detail is there. It is in the document. It is part of the map that the official explanation describes as a routine 1910 land survey. If the explanation is complete, the detail should fit within it. It should have an account. It should make sense in the context of 1910 surveying practices and the information available to surveyors working in that region at that time. It does not fully make sense. Not within that framework. Not without additional explanation that the official record does not currently provide. That gap between what the official explanation confirms and what it leaves unaddressed is narrow, but it is real, and it is precisely the kind of gap that, in document analysis, tends to matter more the closer you look at it. The explanation says the map is from 1910. That may be entirely correct. The map may be exactly what the record says it is, and the anomalous detail may have a straightforward account that simply has not been formally documented or widely discussed. That is genuinely possible. Many historical anomalies have simple explanations that are slow to surface, but the explanation has not yet provided that account. And until it does, the detail remains a question sitting inside an otherwise clean official picture, quiet, unresolved, and waiting for an answer that has not arrived. The first problem with this map is not obvious. It does not announce itself. It sits inside the document quietly, embedded in a section that looks, at first reading, exactly like the rest of the map. The notations are consistent with the surrounding content. The handwriting matches. The ink tone is the same. There is nothing about the appearance of this particular section that draws the eye or signals that something is different here from everything else on the page. But something is different, and once it is identified, it is not easy to set aside. The section in question contains a boundary marker. In the context of land surveying, a boundary marker is a reference point, a fixed location used to establish where one property ends and another begins. It is one of the fundamental elements of any survey document. Without reliable reference points, the boundaries recorded on a map have no stable connection to the physical landscape they are supposed to represent. The accuracy of the entire survey depends, in part, on the accuracy and legitimacy of the markers used to anchor it. In 1910 surveying practice, boundary markers were tied to things that existed and could be verified on the ground. A road junction, a river bend, a stone outcropping, a standing structure of some kind, a wall, a building, a bridge. The principle was straightforward. The reference point had to be real, present, and identifiable by anyone who needed to use the map to locate a boundary in the field. A surveyor could not reference something that did not yet exist, because a future structure cannot serve as a present anchor. The legal validity of the boundary depended on the marker being physically there at the time the survey was conducted. This particular boundary marker, in this particular section of the map, is referenced as though it meets that standard. It is presented as a fixed, existing point in the landscape. There is no qualification. There is no note indicating that the reference is tentative or forward-looking. It reads as a straightforward statement of fact. This structure exists. This boundary is measured from it. and the location recorded here is accurate as of the date of the survey. But this is where it becomes unclear. The structure referenced by that boundary marker, according to records held in a separate archive, was not built until several years after 1910. The construction records are detailed. They include planning documents, approval records, material purchase logs, and completion notices. The timeline they establish is not ambiguous. The structure did not exist in 1910. It did not exist for a number of years after 1910. It came into existence later, and the documentary evidence supporting that later date is held independently, in a different institution, with no known connection to the map or the archive that holds it. That is the problem. Stated plainly, it is this: a map dated 1910 uses as a fixed reference point a structure that was not built until after 1910. The two pieces of evidence, the map and the construction records, cannot both be fully correct as they stand. Either the map is not from 1910, or the construction records are wrong, or something happened between the original creation of the map and its current state that introduced this reference point into the document at a later time. Those are the three basic possibilities. Each of them has implications. None of them has been confirmed. The most accessible explanation, and the one that most people reach for first, is human error. Surveyors sometimes worked from planning documents rather than purely from field observation, particularly in areas where significant construction was already underway or officially scheduled. If a structure had been approved, funded, and was in active planning stages, a surveyor might conceivably have referenced it in a map as though it were already present, anticipating its completion rather than recording its actual current state. That does happen. It is not unheard of in the historical record. Survey documents from the early 20th century occasionally contain references to planned infrastructure that was treated as existing for the purposes of boundary anchoring, on the understanding that the structure would be in place by the time the survey was formally used. It is an imprecise practice, and it was not officially sanctioned, but it occurred. At first, this explanation seems to resolve the problem. If the surveyor was working from planning information and simply assumed the structure would be there, then the anachronistic reference has a straightforward, human explanation. But there's a problem with applying that explanation here. Standard practice, even when surveyors were working from planning documents, was to note the provisional nature of a reference, an annotation, a small qualifying mark, something that signaled to any future reader that this particular reference point was anticipated rather than confirmed. That kind of notation protected the legal integrity of the document. It acknowledged the uncertainty, and it left a clear record that the boundary in that area might need to be re-verified once the reference structure was actually complete. This map has none of that. No annotation, no qualifying mark, no asterisk, no marginal note, no abbreviation indicating that the reference is anything other than a confirmed, existing, physically present landmark. The boundary marker is recorded with the same confidence and the same finality as every other reference point in the document. It is treated, in the language of the map, as a simple fact. That confidence is what does not fully make sense, because if the surveyor knew the structure was not yet built, and they would have known, since they were physically present in the area conducting the survey, then recording it without qualification was either a deliberate choice or a significant oversight. And if it was a deliberate choice, the question becomes, why? Why record a non-existent structure as an existing one, without any notation, in an official legal document? That question does not have a recorded answer. It is worth considering what the practical effect of that choice would have been. A boundary marker tied to a non-existent structure creates an uncertain boundary. Anyone attempting to locate that boundary in the field, using the map as their guide, would find that the reference point they were told to look for was not there. Depending on when they were looking, they might have found nothing, or they might have found construction activity, or they might have found a completed structure years later. The boundary would have been difficult to confirm during the period between the map's creation and the structure's completion. That period of uncertainty, and its potential legal or administrative consequences, is not something the official record addresses. Whether anyone attempted to locate that boundary during those years, whether any disputes arose from the unclear reference, whether any follow-up survey was conducted to address the discrepancy, none of that has been clearly documented, at least not in the records currently associated with this map. This raises questions about the practical history of this document, not just its physical origins, but how it was actually used. A map is not only an archival object, it is a functional document, created to be applied to real decisions about real land. If this map was used to resolve boundary disputes or confirm property ownership during the years when the reference structure did not yet exist, the unreliable marker would have created a real problem. Someone would have noticed, and if someone noticed, there should be a record of that. The absence of such a record is itself worth noting. It could mean that the boundary in question was never formally contested or examined during that period. It could mean that the relevant dispute records have not survived. Or it could mean that the marker's anomalous character was not, in fact, identified at the time, which would raise its own question about how carefully the map was reviewed when it was submitted and filed. Some researchers who have looked at this specific problem argue that the construction records themselves deserve closer scrutiny. Historical construction documentation from the early 20th century is not always as complete or as precise as it appears. Dates in those records can reflect formal completion and approval rather than the actual beginning of a structure's use. In some cases, a structure might have been functionally present, walls up, foundation established, practically operational, before the official records show it as completed. If the structure in question was in a sufficiently advanced state of construction during 1910, a surveyor might have treated it as a usable reference point even before its formal completion date. That argument has some merit. It is the kind of explanation that reminds you how messy real historical timelines can be when you examine them closely. Official dates and practical realities did not always align in early 20th century administrative records. There's genuine room for interpretation here, but others point out that the gap between the map's date and the structure's confirmed existence is not a matter of a few months. The kind of gap that might plausibly reflect the difference between practical use and official completion. The gap is longer, long enough that a surveyor working in 1910 would not have been looking at an almost finished structure. They would have been looking at a site where nothing relevant yet stood. That longer gap is what makes the construction record interpretation difficult to sustain fully. It stretches the explanation further than the evidence comfortably supports. And when an explanation has to be stretched significantly to accommodate the evidence, it is reasonable to ask whether it is actually explaining the evidence or simply containing it. This is where the problem becomes more than a question of surveying practice or administrative habit, because the gap between the map and the construction records is not the kind of gap that resolves easily. It is not a rounding difference. It is not an ambiguity in a completion date. It is a meaningful span of time during which the reference structure, by any reasonable reading of the available evidence, did not exist, and yet the map references it as though it does. There is one more dimension to this that has not been fully examined in the official record. The boundary marker tied to this structure is not in a peripheral or minor area of the map. It is in a section that defines a significant property division, the kind of boundary that would have had practical and legal consequences for the landowners in that area. This was not a decorative element or a minor notational detail. It was a functional anchor for a real boundary. That makes the question of how it got there more consequential. An error in a peripheral area of a map is one thing. An error, or something other than an error, in a section that governs a meaningful property boundary is another. The stakes of the inaccuracy, if it is an inaccuracy, are not trivial. The official record does not address this directly. It confirms the map's date. It describes the survey in general terms. It does not speak to the specific boundary marker, its reference structure, or the discrepancy between the map's timeline and the construction records held elsewhere. That silence is not proof of anything. Records do not always speak to every detail they contain, but it means that the question remains open, unaddressed, and without a formal account. The construction records say one thing, the map says another, and no document currently bridges the gap between them with a clear, complete explanation. The first problem is subtle, but it is real, and it is the kind of real that does not go away simply because it has not yet been formally answered. To understand why the boundary marker anomaly matters as much as it does, it helps to step back and look at the broader environment in which this map was created. Not just the specific survey, and not just the specific region, but the wider system of land documentation that was operating across many parts of the world during the early 1900s. Because when you understand what that system looked like, and what it demanded of the people working within it, the anomaly becomes harder to explain away, not easier. By the time this map was supposedly produced, land surveying had moved well past its informal early stages. It had become a regulated, standardized professional practice in most administratively developed regions. Survey offices operated under written guidelines. Surveyors were trained, examined, and in many cases licensed. The documents they produced were not personal records or informal sketches. They were legal instruments, treated with the same seriousness as court filings or property deeds. They could be cited in legal proceedings. They could be used to settle disputes that had been running for years. They carried real authority. That authority depended entirely on accuracy. And accuracy, in the context of land surveying, had a very specific meaning. It did not simply mean that the measurements were approximately correct. It meant that every element of the document, every boundary line, every distance notation, every reference point, was grounded in something physically verifiable at the time the survey was conducted. The entire system was built on that principle. A reference point that could not be found in the field was not just unhelpful. It was a legal liability. It undermined the document's validity at the point where the unverifiable reference appeared, and depending on how central that reference was to the survey structure, it could compromise much more than just one section. Survey offices knew this. They built their protocols around it. Before a document was formally accepted and filed, it was reviewed. The reference points were checked against field notes. Supervising officials compared the drawn document against the recorded observations to confirm consistency. The process was not perfect. No administrative process is, but it was designed with the explicit goal of catching exactly the kind of error that appears in this map. A reference to a non-existent structure should have been flagged at the review stage, if not earlier. The fact that it was not flagged, or at least that no record of it being flagged has been found, is itself a piece of information worth holding on to. It does not resolve the question of how the marker got there, but it tells you something about the path the document traveled after it was drawn. Either the review process failed to catch the discrepancy, or the discrepancy was present but considered acceptable for reasons that were not recorded, or the review process did not have access to the information that would have revealed the problem, or the marker was not part of the original document when it was reviewed. Each of those possibilities carries different implications, and none of them has been confirmed. Surveyors working in this period were not casual practitioners. The profession had developed its own culture of precision, partly out of genuine commitment to accuracy and partly out of professional self-interest. An inaccurate survey created problems that eventually came back to the surveyor who produced it. Boundary disputes triggered by faulty reference points could result in legal challenges, professional censure, and damage to a surveyor's reputation that was very difficult to recover from in a field where reputation was everything. Surveyors understood the consequences of getting things wrong. They were trained to understand them. The idea that a working professional in this field would casually reference a non-existent structure without any qualifying notation is not consistent with how the profession operated. This is what makes the anomaly harder to dismiss as simple carelessness. Carelessness of that kind, confident, unqualified, in a legally significant section of an official document, does not fit the professional profile of the people who produce these maps. It is not impossible. Professionals make errors. Fatigue, distraction, pressure, and a dozen other human factors can produce mistakes that seem inexplicable in retrospect. But the nature of this particular error, its location in the document, and its apparent confidence are not characteristics that point naturally toward routine carelessness. This raises questions, not about the surveyor personally. We do not know enough about the individual or individuals involved to make personal assessments, but about the document itself, about what it reflects and what it does not. At this point in the investigation, the physical evidence of the document becomes relevant in a new way. Because if the boundary marker anomaly cannot be easily attributed to surveying error, the next question is whether the physical characteristics of the document can shed any light on what happened. And here, the picture is more complicated than it initially appears. The paper used in this map has been analyzed, and the results of that analysis are not disputed. The material is consistent with paper production methods used in the early 20th century. The composition, the weight, the texture, the aging patterns, all of these fall within the range of what you would expect from a document produced during that period. No one examining this paper has argued that it is a modern fabrication or that it comes from a significantly different era. The physical material, taken on its own terms, supports the general time period claimed by the document. But this is where it becomes unclear, because supporting a general time period and confirming a specific date of use are not the same thing. Paper dating works by identifying when the material was produced, not when it was written on. A sheet of paper made in 1908 could have been used in 1910, or in 1915, or in 1920. The paper itself does not record the moment it received ink. It records the era of its manufacture, within a range that varies depending on the methods used and the specific characteristics being analyzed. For a document like this one, where the question is not whether the paper is genuinely old, but whether the content was added at different times, paper dating provides limited resolution. That limitation is not a criticism of the analysis. It is simply a description of what the method can and cannot do. Paper dating is a valuable tool for ruling out obvious anachronisms. A modern paper would be immediately identifiable, and its presence would change the entire conversation about this document. The fact that the paper is consistent with the early 20th century rules out that kind of straightforward forgery. But it does not rule out the possibility that an original document from that period was altered, supplemented, or partially rewritten using materials from the same era. Ink analysis is, in principle, more useful for addressing that kind of question. Ink composition can sometimes be dated more precisely than paper, and the way ink ages and penetrates paper fibers can provide information about the sequence in which different elements of a document were applied. If two notations on the same page were made at significantly different times, a careful ink analysis might detect that difference. The ink on this document was analyzed, but the circumstances of that analysis introduce their own complications. The tests were conducted decades after the document was rediscovered, not immediately upon its arrival at the archive, but later, during a period when interest in the document had increased. By the time the tests were done, the methodologies available were already showing signs of being revised and updated in the broader field of document forensics. The specific techniques applied have since been superseded by more precise approaches that were not available at the time. This means that the ink analysis, while not without value, was conducted using methods that the field no longer considers state-of-the-art. The results it produced are not meaningless, but they carry a level of uncertainty that more current methods might reduce, or might not, depending on what a fresh examination found. The fact that a more thorough, current forensic examination has not been conducted is one of the more significant gaps in this investigation. It is not a gap created by obstruction or deliberate avoidance, as far as anyone can determine. It appears to reflect the ordinary constraints of archival research, limited resources, competing institutional priorities, and the general tendency of historical document analysis to proceed slowly and incompletely. But the gap exists, and it means that the physical evidence, as currently assessed, does not provide the level of certainty that would allow a definitive statement about every element of this document. So where does that leave the physical evidence? It leaves it in a position that is honest but unsatisfying. The paper is from the right era. The ink is broadly consistent with the period. The document does not show the obvious signs of modern fabrication. These are meaningful findings. They confirm that the map is genuinely old and that it belongs, in material terms, to the early 20th century world it claims to represent. But they do not confirm that every mark on it was made at the same time. They do not confirm that the boundary marker in question was part of the original survey document rather than a later edition made using period-consistent materials. They do not close the gap between what the physical analysis can confirm and what the anomaly requires us to explain. Some researchers are comfortable stopping at the physical evidence and saying, the document is from 1910, the anomaly is an error, and the error has not been explained simply because no one has looked hard enough for the explanation yet. That position is not unreasonable. It is cautious, and it avoids reaching beyond what the evidence directly supports. Others argue that the physical evidence, precisely because of its limitations, should not be used to foreclose questions that it cannot actually answer. The paper dating and ink analysis confirm a period, not a specific moment. They confirm consistency, not completeness. Using them to settle a question they were not designed to answer is, in this view, a form of premature closure. That disagreement reflects something real about how document investigation works. Physical evidence and contextual evidence do not always point in the same direction. When they diverge, the investigator has to decide which to weight more heavily, and that decision is rarely without consequences. In this case, the physical evidence says the document is old. The contextual evidence, the construction records, the professional standards of 1910 surveying, the absence of qualifying annotations, says something in this document does not fit its claimed date. The physical evidence does not explain that mismatch. It simply confirms that the material is genuine. And a genuine old document with an unexplained anachronism is not a simple thing. It is not a forged document, but it is not a fully explained one either. That small gap between what the physical analysis confirms and what the anomaly demands is worth keeping in mind, because it means that the most reassuring part of the official account, the part that points to paper and ink and says the document is real, does not actually address the question that matters most. The question is not whether the document is old. The question is whether everything in it belongs to the same moment. And that question, as of the most recent analysis available, remains open. The boundary marker was already a problem. It was already sitting in the document without a clean explanation, already pointing to a gap between what the map claimed and what the independent construction record showed. That, on its own, was enough to make the document worth examining more carefully. But careful examination has a way of surfacing things that faster readings miss. And as researchers continued to work through this map, section by section, notation by notation, something else appeared. It was not connected to the boundary marker, at least not obviously. It was a different kind of irregularity, located in a different part of the document's technical structure. And when it first appeared, it was easy to treat it as a separate, minor issue. The kind of small inconsistency that turns up in old documents and rarely means anything significant on its own. But then its location became clear, and that changed things. The new irregularity involved the coordinate system used in one specific section of the map. To understand why this matters, it helps to understand what a coordinate system does in a survey document. When a surveyor draws a map, they need a consistent mathematical framework that ties every point on the drawn document to a corresponding point in the real landscape. That framework is the coordinate system. It defines how distances are measured, how directions are recorded, and how the positions noted on paper translate to positions on the ground. Without a consistent coordinate system running through the entire document, different sections of the map would not connect accurately to each other. The whole document would lose its internal coherence. Survey offices in any given region typically worked with the standard coordinate system, one that had been officially adopted, published, and distributed to survey teams, so that all documents produced in that region would be compatible with each other. This standardization was important not just for individual maps, but for the broader administrative system. Maps from different surveys of the same area needed to be comparable. Boundaries recorded at different times needed to align. The coordinate system was the shared language that made all of that possible. By 1910, the coordinate system in use in this region was well established. It had been in place long enough that surveyors working there would have been trained in it, familiar with it, and unlikely to deviate from it without a specific reason. The notational conventions associated with it, the way coordinates were written, the reference points they were calculated from, the units used to express distances, were standard professional knowledge in that area at that time. The map, for the most part, reflects that standard. When you read through the coordinate notations across most of the document, they are consistent with the 1910 regional system. The numbers align. The reference framework matches. The document behaves, in this respect, the way a 1910 survey document from this region should behave. But this is where it becomes unclear. In one specific section of the map, the coordinate notation is different. Not dramatically different. Not so different that it immediately signals an error or an inconsistency. The variation is subtle. A degree of shift in the reference framework, a slightly different way of expressing positional data, a calibration that does not quite match the surrounding sections. If you were reading quickly, Or if you were not specifically comparing this section against the known 1910 standard, you might not notice it at all. But when it is measured against that standard, the deviation is real, and its characteristics are recognizable. The coordinate notation in this section corresponds more closely to a reference grid that came into common use in this region approximately a decade after 1910. Not a completely different system, not an incompatible framework, but a version that was updated, recalibrated, and formally adopted later, after the date on the front of this document. At first, this seems like it could be explained. The history of coordinate systems in regional surveying is not a clean, simple story of one system replacing another on a fixed date. Transitions between systems were often gradual. Survey offices in different parts of a region sometimes adopted updates at different times. Individual surveyors who had trained in one area and moved to another sometimes carried their previous habits with them, applying a familiar framework in a new context. There was variation within the profession, and that variation shows up in the historical record. So it is genuinely possible that the coordinate variation in this section reflects nothing more than a surveyor's personal habit, or a local office practice that differed slightly from the regional standard. That explanation has been proposed. It has not been dismissed. However, the timeline does not fully match that explanation when you examine it closely. The specific version of the coordinate framework appearing in this section was not just slightly ahead of the 1910 standard. It was sufficiently different to correspond to an update that was not adopted in this region until roughly a decade later. That is a meaningful gap. A surveyor carrying habits from a different region might account for a minor variation or a slight regional difference. It would not typically account for a notation style that reflects a formal update that had not yet been published or distributed in this area at the time the map was supposedly made. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because if the coordinate variation reflected a personal habit or a regional difference, you would expect to see it distributed more broadly across the document. A surveyor who preferred a certain notation style, or who had trained under a different system, would tend to apply that style consistently. It would appear throughout the sections they worked on. It would not appear in one area and disappear everywhere else. That is not what the map shows. The coordinate variation is confined to a single section. Every other section of the map uses the standard 1910 notation without deviation. Only this one area is different. Only this one corner of the document reflects the later reference framework. That pattern of confinement is significant. It does not fit the personal habit explanation, because personal habits are not section-specific. A surveyor does not use one notation system for most of a document and switch to a different one for a single area. That kind of selective variation is not characteristic of individual working style. It is, however, characteristic of something else, of a section that was produced separately from the rest of the document, at a different time or by a different hand. Some researchers have pointed to this specifically. They note that the confinement of the coordinate variation to one section, rather than its distribution across the document, is more consistent with a localized addition than with a general surveying habit. An addition made later, using a coordinate framework that had become standard by that later time, would naturally reflect the updated system, not because the person making the addition was being careless, but because the later framework was simply what they knew and used. That is a reasonable observation, but it is not confirmed. It is an interpretation of a pattern, not a forensic finding. And interpretations of patterns, however logical they appear, require supporting evidence before they can be treated as conclusions. What makes the coordinate variation more difficult to set aside is its relationship to the first anomaly. This is the point where the investigation shifts from examining two separate irregularities to examining them together. And that shift matters. The boundary marker that references a non-existent structure is in a specific section of the map. The coordinate notation that reflects a later reference framework is also in a specific section of the map. When those two sections are compared, they are not in different areas of the document. They are not spread across the map in a way that suggests independent, unrelated origins. They are in the same area, the same corner, the same portion of the document that, taken as a whole, shows two separate characteristics that are each difficult to reconcile with a 1910 origin. Two anomalies. Same location, That spatial coincidence is what changes the nature of the question. One anomaly in a document can be an error. One unexplained detail can reflect any number of simple, ordinary causes: a lapse in judgment, a copied mistake, a professional shortcut. These things happen. They happen in historical documents regularly, and the records that survive from the early 20th century are full of small imperfections that have perfectly ordinary explanations. But two anomalies of different types in the same section of the same document, that is a different kind of observation. It does not prove anything on its own. The word coincidence exists precisely because unrelated things do sometimes occur together without any connecting cause. Two independent errors landing in the same section of a map is not impossible. Documents have been found with clustered irregularities that turned out to have entirely benign explanations. Many researchers who have looked at this map believe that is what is happening here. They argue that the section in question may have been surveyed by a different member of the team, someone who made both the boundary marker error and the coordinate notation deviation, and that the clustering of the anomalies reflects not a systematic problem with the document, but the work habits and errors of a single individual operating in a limited area. That explanation has internal logic. Survey teams divided their work geographically. Different team members covered different sections. If one person was responsible for this particular area, it is at least plausible that their individual errors and habits would concentrate in that area. But others disagree. They point out that the two anomalies are not the same kind of error. One is a factual reference to something that did not yet exist. The other is a notational system that had not yet been adopted. These are not the kind of mistakes that flow from the same source. One requires ignorance of what was on the ground. The other requires familiarity with a system that was not yet in use. Attributing both to a single surveyor's habits asks that surveyor to have been simultaneously uninformed about the physical landscape and ahead of the professional standard, a combination that does not map cleanly onto any realistic profile of a 1910 field worker. That tension between the two anomalies, their types, and what each implies about whoever produced them, is not something the existing explanations have resolved. It sits in the document, in that one section, as a question that has been identified but not answered. This raises questions that go beyond the individual details, not just what each anomaly is, but what it means that they are together, whether their proximity is meaningful or accidental, whether the section they occupy has a different history from the rest of the document, or whether the document is simply imperfect in a way that has been insufficiently studied. Coincidence is always possible. It is always on the table. But in document analysis, when two independent irregularities share a location, the question of why becomes more than reasonable. It becomes necessary, because if the answer is coincidence, that should be demonstrable. The evidence should be able to support it, and so far, the evidence has not been fully marshaled in either direction. Two anomalies, same location, no confirmed explanation. That is where the investigation stands at this point, and it is a position that is harder to hold comfortably than it was before the second irregularity appeared. By this point in the investigation, two anomalies have already been identified in the same section of the map. The boundary marker that references a structure not yet built, the coordinate notation that reflects a system not yet adopted. Each of those, examined individually, has at least one proposed explanation, imperfect and incomplete, but present. Together, their shared location creates a more difficult problem. But even taken together, a determined skeptic can argue that two errors clustering in one area is unfortunate rather than meaningful. Then the third element appears, and this one is different. It is different not because it is more visible or more dramatic. It is different because the nature of the problem it presents is harder to absorb into the category of error. The first two anomalies could, with effort, be attributed to a surveyor's mistake or habit, a wrong reference, a different notation style. They are the kinds of things that can be explained, however imperfectly, by pointing to human fallibility. The third anomaly does not fit that framework as comfortably. It points to something that fallibility alone does not easily account for. The anomaly is this: the land parcel divisions shown in the problematic section of the map do not match the system that was in use in this region in 1910. They match a system that came later. To understand why that is significant, It helps to understand what land parcel division actually means in the context of survey documentation. When a survey map records land parcels, it is not making an abstract geometric decision. It is recording how land has been officially divided by the administrative authority responsible for that region. Parcel divisions reflect official policy. They use specific unit sizes, measurements of area that the governing system has standardized. They follow specific orientation rules, the directions in which boundary lines are supposed to run, the angles at which parcels are allowed to meet, the way irregular terrain is handled within the official framework. None of this is left to the individual surveyor's discretion. The surveyor records the division pattern that the administrative system has defined. They do not invent it. In this region, the division pattern in use in 1910 was based on an older administrative framework. It had its own unit sizes, its own orientation conventions, its own way of handling the land. It was not a perfect system. By the early 20th century, its limitations were becoming apparent as land use was changing and the older units were increasingly awkward to apply in a modernizing administrative environment. There were discussions within the relevant government offices about the need for reform. Those discussions are part of the historical record. The pressure to update the system was real and recognized. But the reform, when it actually happened, came years after 1910. It was not a minor adjustment. It was a significant administrative overhaul that required the relevant offices to resurvey areas that had been documented under the old system and redraw maps to reflect the new division pattern. New unit sizes, new orientation rules, new boundary conventions. The change was comprehensive enough that existing documents from the pre-reform period were formally superseded in the areas covered by the resurvey. The reform left a clear mark on the administrative record, and the date of its adoption is not in question. The land parcel divisions shown in the anomalous section of this map reflect the post-reform pattern, not approximately, not in a way that could be described as an early gesture toward the coming change. The divisions shown in that section correspond closely to the specific pattern that was formally adopted when the reform was eventually implemented. The unit sizes, the orientations, the boundary conventions, they match what the reform produced. And the map is dated 1910, years before the reform. At first, it seems like this could still be explained. Administrative reforms do not emerge from nothing. They are developed through a process: proposals, reviews, consultations, drafts, revisions. The ideas behind a reform exist before the reform is officially adopted. Someone somewhere was working on what the new system would look like during the years between 1910 and the reform's eventual implementation. If that planning process was underway, even informally, there might have been people with knowledge of the proposed new division pattern before it was officially announced. That observation has led some researchers to propose what might be called the anticipatory mapping explanation. The idea is that a local official, someone with access to the planning discussions around the coming reform, drew the boundaries in this section according to the proposed new pattern rather than the existing one. Perhaps they believed the reform was imminent. Perhaps they were trying to get ahead of the change. Perhaps they had reasons, professional or personal, for wanting the boundaries in this area to reflect the new system before it was officially required. It is a possible explanation. It cannot be completely ruled out. People with inside knowledge of administrative plans sometimes act on that knowledge in unofficial ways, and the early 20th century was not short of officials who operated at the edges of formal procedure when they believed they had good reasons to do so. But this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because anticipatory mapping of an official document, altering the content of a legally binding survey record to reflect a proposed future standard rather than the current official one, was not a permitted practice. It was not a gray area. Unofficial alterations to official survey documents were specifically prohibited, and for clear reasons. A boundary recorded in an official document was legally binding as recorded. If that boundary reflected a proposed future standard rather than the current one, it created a legal fiction, a record that claimed to show the present state of land division while actually showing something that did not yet officially exist. Someone doing this would have known it was irregular. Standard practice, even for informal anticipatory notations, required marking, a note in the margin, an annotation indicating that the boundaries shown were provisional, based on proposed future standards, and subject to official confirmation. That kind of marking protected both the document and the person who made the alteration, by making clear that the notation was not presented as current official fact. There is no such marking in this section. The parcel divisions are presented without qualification. They appear as straightforward recorded fact, indistinguishable in their presentation from every other official notation in the document. Whoever recorded them either did not know they were irregular, which seems difficult given the clear professional standards of the time, or chose not to mark them, which raises a different question about intent. And then there is the accuracy problem. This is the part that some researchers have found genuinely difficult to dismiss. When the reform eventually came, the division pattern it established for this area was specific. The boundaries were set at particular locations, using particular measurements, following a particular orientation logic. The final reform pattern, as formally adopted and documented, is a matter of record. It can be compared directly against what appears in the anomalous section of this 1910 map. That comparison is uncomfortable. The match between the map's division pattern and the final reform outcome is not approximate. It is not a rough alignment that could be explained by someone guessing at the general direction of the coming change. It is specific. The divisions in the map correspond closely to where the reform boundaries actually ended up, not where early proposals suggested they might go, not where general planning logic would have pointed, but where the final, officially adopted boundaries were eventually drawn. This is what does not fully make sense about the anticipatory mapping explanation. Forward planning, even by someone with access to reform proposals, produces approximations. It produces boundaries that reflect the direction of the proposed change, not its final specific outcome. Reforms go through revision. Proposed boundaries shift. Early versions of a reform plan rarely match the final version in precise detail, because the refinement process between proposal and adoption introduces changes. If someone in 1910 was drawing boundaries in anticipation of a future reform, you would expect those boundaries to reflect the early proposal stage, not the final adopted outcome. The final outcome was not determined until the reform was completed. It was the product of a process that had not yet run its course in 1910. Knowing it in advance, with the specificity reflected in this section of the map, would have required access, not just to early proposals, but to the final result of a process that was still years from completion. Some researchers have stopped carefully short of drawing explicit conclusions from this. They note the accuracy of the match and describe it as difficult to explain, without stating what they believe it implies. That caution is methodologically appropriate. A close match between a pre-reform document and a post-reform outcome is unusual, but unusual is not the same as impossible. Coincidence, convergent planning logic, and incomplete records all create space for explanations that have not yet been found. Others have been less restrained in their framing. They argue that the level of precision in the match, the specificity of the correspondence between the 1910 section and the final reform outcome, goes beyond what forward planning or informed guessing can comfortably account for. They do not make explicit claims about what that means, but they argue that the explanation space for this particular anomaly is narrower than for the previous two. That disagreement between caution and concern reflects the position the investigation has reached. Each anomaly individually has at least a proposed explanation. Together, in the same section, they create a combined problem that is harder to resolve. And the third anomaly introduces a characteristic, specific accuracy about a future outcome, that the simpler explanations do not naturally produce. It is worth noting, again, that the section showing all three of these anomalies is not a marginal or peripheral part of the document. It is a section that records land divisions with real legal and administrative consequences. The boundaries drawn there, accurate or not, legitimate or not, would have had practical effects on the people whose land fell within that area. Whether those practical effects were relevant to why the anomalies appear there, whether this section was targeted, if targeting is even the right concept, is a question the investigation has not answered. It has not fully asked it either. The focus, so far, has been on identifying and characterizing the anomalies. The question of purpose, of why this section specifically, and what consequences followed from its content, is a thread that the available records have not yet been pulled on with any systematic force. That thread is there. It connects to the broader history of this document and the land it represents, and it has not been followed to wherever it leads. That is worth keeping in mind as the investigation continues, because 3 anomalies in one section, each of a different type, each presenting its own explanatory challenge, and at least one of them displaying a specificity that is difficult to attribute to chance or foresight, that is no longer a picture that resolves easily into error or habit or coincidence. It is a picture that raises questions the official explanation has not yet been asked to answer directly, and the answers, if they exist, are somewhere in the records that surround this document, not all of which have been fully examined. There's a point in any investigation where individual observations begin to connect, not because a conclusion has been reached, but because the accumulation of separate details starts to suggest that they may not be as separate as they first appeared. That point has been reached here. 3 anomalies have been identified: the boundary marker that references a structure not yet built, the coordinate notation that reflects a system not yet adopted, the land parcel divisions that match a reform outcome not yet determined. Each of these, when first encountered, could be treated as an isolated irregularity, unfortunate, unexplained, but not necessarily connected to anything larger. That is how the first one was treated, initially. And the third made that approach harder to sustain. But it is not just the number of anomalies that has changed the picture. It is their location. All 3 of these irregularities appear in the same section of the map, not approximately the same area, not a general cluster across the left side or the upper portion of the document. The same specific section, bounded by the same lines, covering the same portion of the land the map was made to record. When researchers identified the precise boundaries of the area affected by all 3 anomalies and compared them to one another, the overlap was not rough or approximate. It was close to exact. That spatial concentration is what transforms this from a list of problems into something that resembles a pattern. And patterns, even when they do not prove anything on their own, change the nature of the questions being asked. A pattern asks, why here? Why this section? What is it about this particular area of the map that connects 3 separate anomalies of 3 separate types in the same location? Those are not questions the investigation has answered, but they are questions that the investigation can now reasonably ask, and asking them led researchers to look more carefully at what that specific section of the map actually represents, not just as a portion of a document, but as a piece of recorded land with its own history. What they found was not expected, or perhaps, given everything else, it should have been. The section of the map containing all 3 anomalies corresponds, in its geographical coverage, almost precisely to a parcel of land that was the subject of a significant legal dispute. The dispute began in the decades following 1910 and continued for a substantial period. It was not a minor boundary disagreement between neighboring landowners. It was a contested ownership claim involving competing parties, significant land value, and allegations serious enough to trigger a formal investigation by local authorities. The nature of the dispute is worth understanding in some detail, because the details are relevant to what comes next. The competing claims centered on who held legitimate ownership of the parcel. Multiple parties asserted rights to the land, and their assertions were based on different documents, different interpretations of administrative records, and different accounts of how the land had been divided and transferred over time. This kind of dispute was not uncommon in the post-1910 period, particularly in regions where land use was changing rapidly and administrative records were uneven in their completeness and reliability. What made this dispute notable was one of the allegations that emerged during the proceedings. Among the claims made during the legal process was an allegation that the documentary evidence being used to support one party's ownership claim had been manipulated. Specifically, the allegation involved survey documents, records of land boundaries that, if accurate, supported one party's position, but which the opposing party claimed did not reflect the original survey findings. The allegation of document manipulation was not peripheral to the case. It was one of the central contested questions. A formal investigation was initiated to examine the allegation. That investigation generated its own records, inquiry documents, examination reports, findings, and correspondence between the relevant authorities. Those records exist, at least in part, but this is where it becomes unclear. During an administrative reorganization in the mid-20th century, The records associated with this investigation were among those that were affected. Some were transferred to a new holding institution. Some were consolidated with other files. And some were partially lost. Not destroyed in any documented deliberate sense, but missing from the record sets in a way that has not been fully explained. What survives is incomplete. The full picture of what the investigation examined, what it found, and what conclusions it reached is not available in the archival record as it currently exists. That incompleteness is frustrating in proportion to how relevant those records might be. An investigation into allegations of document manipulation, conducted in connection with a land dispute covering exactly the area of the map that contains 3 unexplained anomalies. The potential relevance is obvious. If the investigation examined this specific map or documents related to it, or if it produced findings about the authenticity of the boundary records in that area, those findings would be directly pertinent to everything that has been discussed here. But those findings, if they exist in any complete form, have not been located. What the partial records do show is that the investigation was real. It was formally constituted, not an informal inquiry. It involved multiple officials. It ran for a period of time, and it reached a point at some stage where it was examining the documentary basis for the competing ownership claims in detail. Beyond that, the record goes quiet. The legal dispute itself was eventually closed. But the closure is significant for what it was not. It was not closed because a clear answer was found. It was not resolved by a ruling that established which party held legitimate ownership and on what basis. It was closed because the practical circumstances that had sustained it had changed. The primary claimants, the people whose competing assertions had driven the dispute for years, had died. The land had changed hands enough times through inheritance, sale, and administrative transfer that re-establishing the original competing claims was considered impractical by the authorities reviewing it. The dispute was set aside. That is different from being resolved. And the underlying question, the one about whether the documentary evidence supporting ownership claims in this area was accurate and original, or whether it had been altered in some way, was never directly addressed in the proceedings. It was raised. It was investigated, at least partially, but the formal record does not show that it was answered before the case was closed. This raises questions that sit uncomfortably alongside everything that has been established about the map's anomalies. The disputed parcel and the anomalous section cover the same ground. The legal dispute included allegations of document manipulation. The investigation into those allegations produced records that are now incomplete, and the map, which contains 3 distinct irregularities all concentrated in that same area, was produced before the dispute began, meaning it was part of the documentary landscape within which that dispute eventually unfolded. Some historians have examined this cluster of connections and argued that it reflects coincidence. The region had multiple land disputes during this period. Document manipulation allegations were not rare. The fact that a map with anomalies covers the same area as a disputed parcel does not establish a causal link between them. The anomalies might have nothing to do with the dispute. The dispute might have had nothing to do with the map. Coincident geography is not the same as connected history. That argument is worth taking seriously. It is a reminder that the appearance of a pattern is not the same as the confirmation of one. People are cognitively inclined to find connections between proximate things, and that inclination can lead to conclusions that the evidence does not actually support. Rigorous investigation requires holding the possibility of coincidence open, even when the connection seems suggestive. But the counterargument is also worth taking seriously. The connections here are not vague or superficial. They are specific. The spatial correspondence between the anomalous section and the disputed parcel is close. The temporal relationship between the map's creation and the dispute's development is relevant. A document produced before a dispute began could have played a role in shaping the conditions that led to the dispute. And the nature of the dispute's central allegation, document manipulation, overlaps directly with the kind of question that the map's anomalies raise. 3 specific connections between 2 specific things. That is not nothing. It is not proof. But it is enough to make the coincidence explanation feel less comfortable than it would if the connections were fewer or more general. The partial loss of the investigation records introduces its own layer of difficulty. Missing records can reflect nothing more than the ordinary attrition that affects administrative archives over decades. Reorganizations lose things. Transfers damage things. Storage conditions deteriorate things. The gap in the investigation record may be entirely mundane in its origins, but missing records are also, in the history of contested investigations, sometimes missing for reasons that are less mundane. The investigation into the document manipulation allegation was examining a sensitive question, one with financial and legal consequences for real parties with real interests. Whether the incompleteness of those records reflects ordinary archival loss or something more deliberate is a question that cannot be answered without evidence that is not currently available. That uncertainty sits on top of everything else, and it means that one of the most directly relevant sources of information for understanding this map and its anomalies is a set of records that cannot be fully read. What the investigation has at this point is a convergence, a map with 3 anomalies in one section, a legal dispute covering the same section, an allegation of document manipulation within that dispute, an investigation that examined the allegation and produced incomplete records, a case that was closed without a finding on the central question, and a map that is still in an archive, still dated 1910, still containing the same 3 anomalies that have not been explained. Each of these elements, individually, has context that makes it understandable in isolation. Anomalies appear in old documents. Disputes arise over land. Investigations produce incomplete records. Cases close without resolution. But together, in this specific arrangement, around this specific section of this specific document, they do not fully resolve into something comfortable. They sit in a relationship with each other that has not been adequately examined, possibly because the records needed to examine it are no longer complete. The pattern is there. What it means has not been determined, and the possibility that it means something significant, that the anomalies and the dispute and the allegation and the lost records are connected in ways that the available evidence has not yet been able to demonstrate, has not been closed off. It has simply not been answered. And setting something aside is not the same as resolving it. At a certain point in this investigation, the focus shifts. It moves away from the individual anomalies, each of which has been examined, described, and found to be without a clean explanation, and toward the wider question of what those anomalies might mean if they are not the result of accident or error. That shift is not a conclusion. It is a direction, and the direction leads somewhere that extends beyond the map itself, beyond the disputed parcel, and into the broader landscape of how land documentation was handled during this period and what was possible within that landscape. The question being asked at this stage is not whether something irregular happened. The question is what kind of irregular thing is actually consistent with the evidence. And answering that question requires understanding what the historical record shows about document manipulation in early 20th century land administration more generally. Historians who have spent significant time studying land records from this period are largely in agreement on one point. Boundary manipulation in official survey documents was not a rare occurrence. It happened across many regions, in many administrative contexts, and for a range of reasons. That is not a controversial finding. It is well documented. The cases that have been identified and studied provide a clear picture of what motivated people to alter official records, what methods they used, and what conditions made those alterations possible. The motivations were primarily practical. Land had economic value, and the administrative reforms sweeping through many regions during the early 20th century created windows of opportunity that did not exist in more stable periods. When a government announced that land division systems were going to change, when new unit sizes, new boundary conventions, and new ownership frameworks were coming, the period between announcement and implementation became a zone of significant legal and financial uncertainty. People with knowledge of what the new framework would look like, and with the access and ability to alter existing documents, could use that knowledge to position land boundaries in ways that would be advantageous under the new system. The opportunity was real because the administrative systems of the time had genuine vulnerabilities. Document review processes were thorough by the standards of the era, but they were not forensic. They were designed to catch obvious errors and gross irregularities, not subtle alterations made with skill and access. A person who understood the system well enough to know what reviewers looked for, and who had access to the right materials, could make changes to official documents that would pass standard review without detection. Most of the manipulation cases that historians have documented from this period involved what might be described as simple interventions. A line redrawn slightly, a number changed, a boundary notation altered to move a line a few meters in a direction that benefited one party over another. These were targeted, minimal changes, enough to shift legal outcomes, but small enough to avoid easy detection. They worked by operating within the existing documentary framework, rather than introducing new elements that might attract scrutiny. But this is where the map in question becomes unusual within that historical context, because what the anomalies in this document appear to show is not the simple kind of manipulation that the historical record most commonly documents. They show something different in character. They show the integration of future-dated information, a boundary marker tied to a structure not yet built, a coordinate system not yet adopted, a land division pattern matching a reform outcome not yet determined, into a document that is otherwise consistent with its claimed period. That distinction matters. Simple manipulations work with information that exists. They move a line, change a number, alter a reference within the existing framework. They do not require the manipulator to have knowledge of the future. They require access and skill, but the content they introduce is drawn from the present or the recent past. The anomalies in this map, if they are not original, introduce content that did not exist at the document's claimed date. That is a different kind of problem entirely. It does not fit the pattern of simple manipulation. It requires something more. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because if the anomalous content was introduced into this document at some point after its original creation, whoever introduced it had to have known, at the time of introduction, what certain future administrative outcomes would look like. The specific coordinate system, the specific reform boundaries. These are not things that could be estimated or guessed with the precision the document shows. They are specific, official outcomes that existed only after formal administrative processes had been completed. That creates a narrow set of possibilities for how such information could have been available before it was publicly adopted. The first possibility is extraordinary foresight, someone who simply predicted, with unusual accuracy, what the coming administrative changes would produce. That is theoretically possible, but practically very difficult to sustain as an explanation, because the level of precision involved exceeds what informed prediction typically achieves. Predictions are approximate. The content in this section is specific. The second possibility is access to unreleased planning documents. Administrative reforms do not arrive without prior development. They are planned, drafted, revised, and approved through internal processes that produce documents at each stage. Those internal documents, the proposals, the draft frameworks, the working versions of what would become official policy, were not public, but they existed. They circulated within the relevant government offices. Someone with the right institutional position could have had access to advanced drafts that showed, with near-final specificity, what the coming reform would produce. If that access existed and was used, it would explain how the post-reform content entered the document with the precision it shows. It would not require predicting the future. It would require having read documents that the public had not yet seen. This raises questions about who, in the relevant administrative environment, would have had that kind of access and also had a connection to the land in question. That intersection between institutional access to reform planning documents and personal interest in the specific parcel covered by the anomalous section is a narrow one. It would not describe many people, but identifying who it might describe requires information about the administrative personnel and land ownership records of the period that has not been systematically compiled in connection with this investigation. The third possibility is the most structurally significant: involvement by someone with authority over the reform process itself. Not just access to planning documents, but participation in their creation. Someone in that position would not have been reading about the future reform from the outside. They would have been shaping it from the inside. They would have known, with certainty, what the final boundaries and frameworks would be, because they were among the people deciding what those boundaries and frameworks would be. That possibility, if it were supported by evidence, would carry significant implications. It would mean that the anomalous section of this map was not the work of an opportunist working at the margins of the administrative system. It would mean the work of someone operating at its center, using their position to embed future official outcomes into an existing document before those outcomes were publicly known. None of these three possibilities has been confirmed. That needs to be stated clearly. The investigation has not produced evidence that identifies a specific person, a specific motive, or a specific mechanism by which the anomalous content entered this document. What it has produced is a set of anomalies that are inconsistent with the document's claimed date. A historical context that shows manipulation of this type was both motivated and possible, and a narrowing of the explanation space toward possibilities that all require something more than simple error or carelessness. None of them have been formally ruled out either. And that symmetry, unconfirmed but also unexcluded, is where the investigation currently sits. What makes this position more uncomfortable than it might otherwise be is the absence of a modern forensic examination. This is a significant gap, and it is worth examining clearly. The analytical methods available to document investigators today are substantially more capable than what was applied to this map when it was first studied. Current forensic techniques can examine ink composition at a molecular level, detecting differences in chemical formulation that would allow inks from different periods to be distinguished even when they appear visually identical. They can examine the layering of marks on paper in ways that reveal sequence, which notation was applied first, which was applied later, whether different elements of a document were produced in the same session or at different times. They can detect traces of erasure, overwriting, or physical alteration that are invisible to the naked eye and to the older analytical methods previously used. These techniques have been applied to historical documents in other investigations. They have produced findings that changed assessments that had stood for decades. Documents believed to be original turned out to contain later additions, and documents suspected of manipulation turned out to be entirely genuine. The methods are not infallible, but they represent a meaningfully higher level of analytical resolution than what was available when this map was last examined. The map has not been subjected to these methods, not because the question has been settled, and not because the anomalies have been explained, but because the formal priority and institutional resources required to commission that kind of examination have not been directed at this specific document. It remains in its archive, accessible, studied by researchers working with conventional historical methods, but not yet placed under the kind of analytical scrutiny that might resolve some of the open questions about its physical composition. That absence is its own kind of gap, not a gap in the document, but a gap in the investigation of the document. The most direct path toward answering whether the anomalous section was produced at the same time as the rest of the map, the question that underlies almost everything else discussed here, runs through a forensic examination that has not been conducted. Some researchers have argued that commissioning such an examination should be a straightforward institutional decision. The document exists. The questions are documented. The methods are available. The reasons to want an answer are clear. What is less clear is why the examination has not happened, and whether that absence reflects nothing more than ordinary institutional inertia or something more deliberate. That question has not been asked loudly. It sits in the background of the investigation, present but not pursued, and in its own quiet way, it is as unresolved as the anomalies themselves. What the investigation has established by this point is that the implications of the anomalies, if they are not accidental, are larger than a single document and a single disputed parcel. They reach into questions about administrative access, institutional knowledge, the mechanics of document manipulation at a level of sophistication beyond simple alteration, and the conditions under which future information could have been embedded in a past-dated record. Those are not small questions. They are questions with historical weight, and they are sitting unanswered in a document that has not yet been examined with the tools that might be able to answer them. That combination, significant questions, available methods, absent examination, is the gap that defines where this investigation stands. Not at a conclusion, not at a resolution, but at a point where the path forward is visible, and the question of why it has not been taken is itself something worth asking. It would be a significant omission, at this stage of the investigation, to present only the evidence that raises questions without also presenting the counterargument seriously. That kind of one-sided examination is not investigation. It is selection. And the researchers who have studied this map include people who have looked carefully at the same anomalies and reach conclusions that are considerably less troubled than the questions raised so far might suggest. Not everyone who has worked with this document believes the anomalies point toward manipulation. Not everyone believes they represent a fundamental problem with the map's claimed origins. There are alternative readings of the evidence, thoughtful, grounded readings, offered by people with genuine expertise, that deserve to be examined with the same care that the anomalies themselves have received. The first, and probably the most developed of these alternative perspectives, centers not on the document itself, but on the people who produced it. Specifically, it centers on the possibility that the anomalies are not the product of deception or alteration, but of an unusually well-connected individual who contributed to the map's creation and brought knowledge with them that most surveyors in that period would not have had. The historical record for this region in the early 1910s includes reference to at least one survey official who occupied an unusual professional position. This individual was a working surveyor, active in the field, conducting surveys of the kind that produce documents like this map, but also maintained documented ties to the administrative planning office responsible for the regional reforms that were, at that time, in various stages of development. The nature of those ties is not entirely clear from the surviving records. They appear to have been partly professional and partly personal, reflecting the kind of overlapping institutional relationships that were common in regional administrative environments of that era. What those ties potentially meant, in practical terms, is access, not formal, officially sanctioned access to restricted planning documents, but the informal kind of access that comes from knowing the right people, working in adjacent offices, and being present in conversations and environments where future administrative plans were being discussed before they were publicly announced. This kind of informal knowledge transfer was not unusual. It happened in administrative systems throughout this period, in many regions, and it occasionally left traces in the documents produced by the people who benefited from it. If this particular survey official contributed to the section of the map that contains the anomalies, the argument runs, then what appears as anachronistic information would actually be insider knowledge. The boundary marker tied to a structure not yet built might reflect awareness of a construction plan that was already decided but not yet publicly known. The coordinate notation reflecting a later system might reflect familiarity with a proposed framework being discussed in planning circles. The land division pattern matching the final reform outcome might reflect access to a draft proposal that was already close to its final form. Under this interpretation, the map is exactly what it claims to be, a 1910 survey document, and its anomalies are the traces of one informed individual's working knowledge, embedded in an official document without annotation because that individual did not consider it unusual to use the most current information available to them, regardless of whether it had been formally adopted yet. That is a coherent explanation. It has the advantage of not requiring any deliberate deception or post hoc alteration. It attributes the anomalies to human character, to one person's access and habits, rather than to a more complex intervention. And it is grounded in a documented historical figure whose institutional position makes the explanation at least plausible. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the explanation depends on a set of assumptions that the historical record supports only partially. The survey official in question is documented as having ties to the planning office. That is confirmed. What is not confirmed is whether they contributed to this specific section of this specific map. The archival record does not establish, with any directness, that this individual's work is represented in the anomalous section. The connection between the person and the document is inferential, not documented. And inferential connections, however logical they seem, are not the same as established facts. There's also the question of the precision of the anomalies. The insider knowledge explanation works most comfortably when the information embedded in the document reflects the general direction of coming changes, the broad shape of the new coordinate system, the approximate approach of the land reform. It works less comfortably when the information matches the final, specific outcomes with the degree of accuracy that some researchers have identified in this map. Even someone with informal access to planning discussions would typically be working with proposals, not final determinations. The gap between a proposal and its final adopted form can be significant, and if the content in the anomalous section reflects the final form rather than an earlier proposal, The insider knowledge explanation begins to require that the insider had access at a level closer to final decision-making than informal ties to a planning office would typically provide. That gap is where the first alternative explanation starts to show its limits. It accounts for the anomalies in general terms, but struggles with their specificity. The second alternative perspective approaches the document from a different angle entirely. Rather than looking for a person who could explain the anomalous content, it looks at the document itself and asks whether the framing assumption that this is a single, unified document produced at a single point in time is actually correct. The composite document theory holds that what is described as a 1910 survey map may not be a single original object. It may be an original document that was subsequently updated, supplemented, or partially redrawn, and that the combination of original and later material is what researchers have been studying all along without fully recognizing it as a combination. Composite documents are a recognized phenomenon in archival history. They arise for various reasons: administrative updates, damage repair, partial resurveying, or deliberate supplementation, and they can be difficult to identify if the added material was produced using period-consistent methods and integrated carefully into the original. Under this theory, the anomalous section would represent a later addition or revision, grafted onto the original 1910 survey at some point after the post-reform information it contains had become available. The rest of the document is genuinely from 1910. The anomalous section is from a later period, produced using materials consistent enough with the original to avoid easy detection by standard analysis. This explanation has an important advantage over the insider knowledge theory. It does not require anyone to have known, in 1910, what future administrative outcomes would be. It simply requires that someone, at a later point, when those outcomes were known, had both the access and the motivation to introduce them into an existing document. That is a less demanding set of requirements. It asks less of any individual involved and more of the document's physical history. But there is a significant problem with the composite document theory, and it is the same problem that has limited the investigation throughout. No physical evidence of layering, overwriting, or compositional inconsistency has been confirmed by the tests conducted on this document. The existing analysis has not found clear markers of the kind that typically indicate a composite structure. Differences in paper aging patterns between sections, ink application inconsistencies that suggest different production dates, physical seams or joins that would indicate separate pieces of material combined into one object. Those markers have not been identified. That absence does not disprove the composite theory. As has been noted, the tests previously conducted were not using the most current forensic methods, and the limits of those tests are real. It is possible that evidence of a composite structure exists in the document and has simply not been detected by the methods applied so far. But it means the composite theory, while logically coherent, is not currently supported by the physical evidence available. It remains a possibility, not a finding. The third alternative perspective is less developed than the first two, and is acknowledged even by its proponents as more speculative. But it is worth examining because it approaches the problem from the most fundamental level. This perspective questions whether the starting assumption, that the map is from 1910 because it says it is the right place to begin the analysis. It asks, what if the date itself is not original? What if the 1910 notation was added to the document, either by mistake or deliberately, and the map actually belongs to a later period, one in which the structures, coordinate systems, and land division patterns shown in the anomalous section were current rather than anachronistic? Under this reading, there are no anomalies in the true sense. There is simply a document from a slightly later date that has been misdated, either through administrative error during the cataloging process or through a deliberate act of backdating. The content of the map would reflect the state of knowledge and the administrative standards of its actual production date, which would fall sometime after the reforms that the anomalous section appears to anticipate. This explanation would resolve all three anomalies at once. It would make the boundary marker, the coordinate system, and the land division pattern all contemporaneous, rather than anachronistic. It would be, in that sense, the cleanest explanation available, but it is also the explanation that faces the most direct challenge from the physical evidence. The paper and ink analysis, limited as those tests may be, did confirm consistency with early 20th century materials. A document produced a decade or more later than 1910 would be expected to show material differences that would be detectable. The analysis has not found those differences, and while the limitations of the tests allow some room for doubt, attributing the entire document to a significantly later period requires dismissing physical evidence rather than simply acknowledging its limits. That is a more aggressive interpretive step than the other theories require, which is why this perspective remains less widely held. So the investigation stands before three alternative explanations, each with its own logic and its own problems. The insider knowledge theory fits the human context but struggles with the precision of the anomalies. The composite document theory fits the documentary history but lacks physical confirmation. The misdating theory resolves the anachronisms cleanly but conflicts with the physical evidence more directly than the other two. Some believe one of these explanations is essentially correct and simply needs more evidentiary support to be confirmed. Others disagree, arguing that none of them fully accounts for the combination of features present in the document. And that fundamental disagreement between researchers who have examined the same evidence and reached different assessments of what it shows is not a sign of sloppy thinking or inadequate investigation. It is a sign that the evidence genuinely supports more than one reading, that the document is, in the language of historical analysis, ambiguous, not in a trivial way, in a way that has persisted through multiple rounds of examination by multiple researchers across an extended period of time. Each theory fits some of the evidence. None of them fits all of it. That asymmetry, where explanations are partial but no explanation is complete, is precisely why the question remains open, not because investigators have been insufficiently thorough, but because the document itself has not yet yielded a response that closes the gap between what is known and what needs to be explained. That gap is still there, and the fact that three serious alternative explanations exist without any of them achieving consensus is itself a form of answer, not to the original question, but to the question of how difficult that original question actually is. There are investigations that end with answers. The evidence accumulates, the pieces align, and at some point a conclusion becomes available. Not necessarily a perfect conclusion, not one that resolves every minor detail, but one that accounts for the central question in a way that most serious observers can accept. Those investigations close. The question that opened them is answered, filed, and moved past. This investigation has not reached that point, and it is worth being honest about why. It is not because the investigation has been superficial. The document has been examined. The anomalies have been identified and described in specific terms. The historical context has been mapped. The alternative explanations have been laid out and tested against the available evidence. The connections between the map, the disputed land, and the unresolved legal proceedings have been traced as far as the surviving records allow. A considerable amount of careful work has been done on a document that most people would have looked at once and set aside without a second thought. But careful work, applied to incomplete evidence, does not always produce resolution. Sometimes it produces a clearer picture of exactly how much remains unknown. And that is, honestly, where this investigation stands. The document still sits in its archive. The folder is still worn. The paper is still aged in the way that old paper ages, slowly, evenly, in a manner consistent with the early 20th century, as the physical analysis confirmed. Nothing about its appearance has changed. It looks, as it always has, like a routine administrative document from over a century ago. The kind of thing that passes through archival hands without memorable incident, except for that one section, and the three things within it that do not match. Those three anomalies: the boundary marker tied to a structure not yet built, the coordinate notation reflecting a system not yet adopted, the land division pattern matching a reform outcome not yet determined, have not been explained away. They have been examined. They have been discussed. Alternative interpretations have been proposed for each of them, individually and in combination. But none of those interpretations has achieved consensus, and none of them has been supported by evidence strong enough to close the question definitively. That is a specific kind of failure. Not a failure of effort, but a failure of resolution. The investigation has succeeded in defining the problem clearly. It has not succeeded in solving it. The official record continues to describe this map as a routine 1910 land survey. That description is not false, in the sense that it reflects what the document was cataloged as and what the standard physical analysis confirmed within its limits. The institution holding the document has no formal reason to revise that description based on the current state of the evidence. The anomalies have been noted by researchers, but noting anomalies is not the same as establishing a finding that requires an official response. And so the document remains classified as what it has always been classified as: a 1910 survey, routine, administrative, unremarkable in the institutional sense, even if it is no longer unremarkable to the people who have looked at it carefully. That gap between the official classification and the questions the document actually raises is one of the quieter aspects of this situation. It does not require explanation in terms of cover-up or suppression. Institutional classifications are rarely updated on the basis of unresolved scholarly disagreement. That is simply how archives work. But it does mean that someone approaching this document without prior knowledge of the investigation would encounter it in its default state, filed, dated, and described as something that the available evidence does not fully support and does not fully contradict. This raises questions about how many other documents in similar situations exist in similar archives. Not just documents with unexplained anomalies, but documents where the anomalies have been noticed, discussed, and left unresolved, sitting in their folders, classified as ordinary, while the questions they raise remain quietly open in the margins of academic literature that most people will never read. That is not a specific claim about any other document. It is an observation about the nature of archival investigation and its relationship to institutional record-keeping. The forensic record for this document is incomplete. That has been established clearly. The tests that were conducted, when they were conducted, using the methods available at that time, produced results that confirmed the document's general period of origin without resolving the more specific questions about whether all of its content was produced at the same time. The methods that might answer those more specific questions, the current forensic techniques that can examine ink composition at molecular levels, detect layering and sequencing, identify traces of alteration invisible to earlier analysis, have not been applied. That examination has not happened, and the reason it has not happened is not documented in any way that explains the absence as a deliberate decision. It may simply be a matter of resources and priority. Modern forensic document examination is expensive, time-consuming, and requires institutional coordination that does not happen automatically, without a formal mandate, without a specific legal or administrative reason to commission the examination, and without the kind of public or scholarly pressure that sometimes moves institutions to act. The document remains where it is, examined only as far as the existing record goes. Whether that changes, whether someone eventually makes the case successfully for a full modern forensic examination, is unknown. It is one of the genuinely open threads in this investigation, not because it would necessarily produce a definitive answer, but because it would produce information that the current record does not contain, and that information might shift the balance of the evidence in one direction or another in ways that cannot be predicted without conducting the examination. The administrative history of this document has gaps. The custody record has quiet periods. The investigation records associated with the legal dispute that covered the same land are incomplete. The partial loss of those investigation records during a mid-century administrative reorganization removed from the accessible record some of the most directly relevant historical material. Whether those lost records contained information that would have clarified the relationship between the map and the dispute is unknown. That they might have is enough to keep the absence significant. The researchers who have examined this document disagree on what the anomalies mean. That disagreement is not between careless thinkers and careful ones. It is between careful thinkers who have looked at the same evidence and weighted it differently. Some find the alternative explanations adequate, if imperfect. Some find the anomalies, particularly their concentration in a single section and their correspondence to the disputed land, too specific and too consistent to attribute to coincidence or routine error. Some sit in between, willing to acknowledge the questions without committing to any particular account of their origin. That range of opinion, across researchers who have engaged seriously with the document, reflects something real about the evidence. It reflects genuine ambiguity, not the manufactured ambiguity of a mystery story, but the actual, uncomfortable ambiguity of a historical record that does not provide enough information to settle the question it raises. There's no clear evidence of forgery. That needs to be stated plainly and kept in view. The document is old. The material is genuine. Nothing in the physical analysis has produced a finding that would support a straightforward claim of fabrication. Anyone who approaches this investigation looking for a clean conclusion about deliberate fraud will not find the evidence for that conclusion here. The record does not support it, but there is no clean explanation either. That also needs to be stated plainly. The three anomalies exist. They are in the same section. That section covers the same ground as a disputed land parcel. The dispute included allegations of document manipulation that were investigated and never resolved. The investigation records are incomplete. The map has not been subjected to modern forensic examination, and no proposed explanation for the anomalies has achieved consensus among the researchers who have studied them. The absence of evidence for forgery and the absence of a clean explanation are not the same thing. They coexist, and their coexistence is what defines the current state of this investigation. It is possible to hold both of those things at once, to say that this document is not demonstrably forged, while also saying that it is not fully explained, without contradiction. What the document does not do is resolve quietly into either of the comfortable positions that people often look for when they encounter historical anomalies. It is not a confirmed fraud, and it is not a confirmed ordinary document. It occupies the less comfortable middle space between those two positions, where the evidence is real but incomplete, where the questions are specific but unanswered, and where the most honest statement available is that the matter remains open. The map still exists. That is a simple and important fact. Whatever its origins, whatever the history of its content, the physical object is there, accessible in an archive, capable in principle of being examined more thoroughly than it has been. The questions it raises are not theoretical. They are attached to a real document that can be looked at, tested, and studied with methods that were not available when it was last seriously examined. The anomalies are still there. They have not been explained away, and they have not disappeared under closer examination. If anything, closer examination has made them more specific and more difficult to account for than they appeared initially. That is sometimes how investigations work. The closer you look, the sharper the problem becomes, even when the solution does not follow. And the question of what the anomalies mean remains, for now, unanswered. Not because the question is unanswerable in principle, but because the examination that might answer it has not been completed. The evidence that might settle the disagreement among researchers has not been gathered. The forensic gap has not been closed. The lost investigation records have not been recovered. The full history of the disputed land and its connection to this document has not been traced to a conclusion. All of those threads are still open, not dramatically open, not in a way that signals imminent revelation or suggests that an answer is just around the next archival corner, but open in the quiet, persistent way that unresolved historical questions tend to remain open, present, documented, acknowledged by those who have looked closely enough, and waiting for someone with the right combination of access, resources, and sustained attention to take the next step. Whether that step is ever taken is itself unknown. The document may remain in its current state indefinitely, filed, dated, partially studied, and quietly unresolved, while the institution that holds it continues to describe it as a routine administrative artifact from 1910. Or someone may eventually look at it with the tools that have not yet been applied and find something in its physical structure that changes the picture. That possibility is real. It is not guaranteed, but it has not been foreclosed. The folder is still worn. The paper is still old. The anomalies are still there. And the question, for now, remains exactly where it has been since the moment someone first looked closely enough to notice that one small detail did not match. There are investigations that end with answers. The evidence accumulates, the pieces align, and at some point a conclusion becomes available. Not necessarily a perfect conclusion, not one that resolves every minor detail, but one that accounts for the central question in a way that most serious observers can accept. Those investigations close. The question that opened them is answered, filed, and moved past. This investigation has not reached that point, and it is worth being honest about why. It is not because the investigation has been superficial. The document has been examined. The anomalies have been identified and described in specific terms. The historical context has been mapped carefully. The alternative explanations have been laid out and tested against the available evidence, one by one. The connections between the map, the disputed land, and the unresolved legal proceedings have been traced as far as the surviving records allow. A considerable amount of careful, patient work has been done on a document that most people would have looked at once and set aside without a second thought, without ever noticing that anything was wrong. But careful work, applied to incomplete evidence, does not always produce resolution. Sometimes it produces a clearer picture of exactly how much remains unknown. And that is, honestly, where this investigation stands today. The document still sits in its archive. The folder is still worn at the edges. The paper is still aged in the way that old paper ages, slowly, evenly, in a manner consistent with the early 20th century, as the physical analysis confirmed. Nothing about its outward appearance has changed over the years it has been studied. It looks, as it always has, like a routine administrative document from over a century ago. The kind of thing that passes through archival hands without memorable incident. The kind of thing that no one is supposed to look at twice, except for that one section, and the three things within it that do not match. Those three anomalies have not been explained away. They have been examined. They have been discussed at length. Alternative interpretations have been proposed for each of them, individually and in combination. But none of those interpretations has achieved consensus among the people who have studied this document seriously. And none of them has been supported by evidence strong enough to close the question in any direction. The boundary marker that references a structure not yet built is still there. The coordinate notation that reflects a system not yet adopted is still there. The land division pattern that matches a reform outcome not yet determined is still there. Three separate problems. Same section. Same unresolved status. That is a specific kind of outcome. Not a failure of effort, but a failure of resolution. The investigation has succeeded in defining the problem with considerable clarity. It has not succeeded in solving it. And that distinction matters, because a well-defined unsolved problem is more honest than a poorly defined one that has been prematurely closed. The official record continues to describe this map as a routine 1910 land survey. That description is not false in the technical sense. It reflects what the document was cataloged as, and what the standard physical analysis confirmed within its acknowledged limits. The institution holding the document has no formal reason to revise that description based on the current state of the scholarly conversation. Anomalies noted by researchers do not, on their own, trigger institutional reclassification. That is simply how archives operate. The gap between what the document is officially described as and what the evidence actually leaves open is not unusual. It is the normal condition of unresolved historical questions sitting inside institutional systems that were not designed to hold uncertainty. And so the document remains classified as what it has always been classified as: routine, administrative, a 1910 survey, unremarkable in the institutional sense, even though it is no longer unremarkable to anyone who has spent time with its contents. The forensic record for this document is incomplete. That has been established clearly throughout this investigation. The tests that were conducted, when they were conducted, using the methods available at that time, produced results that confirmed the general period of origin without resolving the more specific questions about whether all of the document's content was produced at the same moment. The methods that could answer those more specific questions have not been applied. The examination that might shift the balance of the evidence has not been commissioned, and the reason it has not happened is not recorded anywhere in a way that explains the absence as a deliberate decision. It may be nothing more than the ordinary consequence of limited resources and competing institutional priorities, but it means that the most direct path toward a more definitive answer has not been taken. The administrative history of this document has gaps, quiet periods in the custody record where the document's whereabouts and handling are not fully accounted for, an investigation into document manipulation allegations that generated records, some of which survived and some of which did not, a legal dispute that was closed without resolution, not because the central question was answered, but because the circumstances that sustained it had changed. Each of these gaps, individually, is unremarkable. Together, In the context of a document with unexplained anomalies covering the exact same ground as the disputed land, they form a historical silence that has not been adequately examined. There's no clear evidence of forgery. That must be stated plainly and kept in view. The material is genuine. The document is old. Nothing in the physical analysis has produced a finding that supports a straightforward claim of fabrication. The record does not support that conclusion, and claiming it would go beyond what the evidence actually shows. But there's no clean explanation either. The three anomalies exist. They remain in the same section. That section covers the same ground as an unresolved land dispute. The dispute included manipulation allegations that were investigated and never formally resolved. And no proposed explanation for what appears in that section has achieved the kind of consensus that would allow the question to be set aside with confidence. The absence of evidence for forgery and the absence of a clean explanation are not the same thing. They coexist, and their coexistence is precisely what defines the current state of this matter. It is possible and necessary to hold both of those positions at once without contradiction. The map still exists. The anomalies are still there. The examination that might resolve them has not been conducted. The records that might have provided direct context are partially lost. The researchers who have looked most carefully at this document do not agree on what they have found. And the question of what those anomalies mean, how they got there, what they reflect, whether they point to something in the document's history that the official record has never addressed, remains, for now, exactly where it has been since the moment someone first looked closely enough to notice. Unanswered, undismissed, and waiting.